The rowing machine, one of the most popular pieces of cardio equipment you'll find in the gym, but often done incorrectly. Whether your goal is to compete in your first high rocks, you want to do CrossFit, functional fitness, or you just want to develop your engine, this is going to be a piece of equipment you want to use. However, often done incorrectly. So today I'm going to show you some thoughts and fixes, optimal rowing technique, and talk about a couple of nerdy bits like force curves and drag factor as well. So stick around. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is talk about optimal rowing technique. So we've got various different phases of the rowing technique that we're going to go through. The first one is going to be the catch. So your catch position should look something like this. What we want is for your shins to be relatively vertical, your arms to be nice and long and relaxed, and we want to think about keeping our spine nice and tall in this position. So reason for this, what we want to do is initiate the pull by driving through with our legs first. Then what that's going to allow us to do is set ourselves up for a really good position and for us to be able to develop and generate lots of power when we go towards the end of the stroke. So this catch position here is really important. So spine nice and tall, arms nice and long, almost let the handle be in your fingertips as opposed to you death gripping it like this. And then you're going to initiate by pushing through with your legs first as we move into the next portion of the stroke. So after the catch, the next thing that we want to be moving into is the drive phase. So what I'm thinking about doing is pushing through with my legs first. So I want to keep this 11 o'clock position on the clock. So I've got a slight forward lean of my torso and my legs are initiating the movement first. So I'm imagining that I'm on a leg press and I'm pushing that leg press machine away from me with my arms being nice and relaxed. What I like to think about doing here is keeping, like I said, the handle in my fingertips as opposed to my knuckles over the top, and that allows me to keep my arms relaxed and for my legs to be pushing through first. Once my handle gets past my knees, I want to think about moving and extending through my hips. This is where the power is really generated when we start to get this hip swing in this position here. I'm going to talk about force curves a little bit later on and some common faults, but the issue is when people throw their shoulders back early rather than driving through with their legs first before they initiate the hip swing. Once I've gone through the drive phase, I'm then going to move into my finish position, which is going to be at the top of my movement here. So what I'm thinking about doing is as I've extended through with my knees, I'm going to finish with my hips and I'm going to pull through with my arms in this position here. This position here is about 1 o'clock. So my arms are going to be relatively relaxed once I finish in that position. I don't need to be yanking or pulling really, really hard into here. We just want to be finishing at about chest or the top of the abs. We don't need to be low and we don't need to be pulling up to our throat. The recovery is the final portion of the stroke, and that's when we just do everything in reverse. So we start with the arms first, so arms nice and long, then we move through with the torso, and then we start to bend through the knees. Eventually I'm going to get back into that catch position again, shins vertical, arms nice and long, slight forward lean in the torso, and then we just repeat the process all over again. So catch, drive, finish, recovery. So now that we've covered optimal technique, I'm going to talk about some common faults that I see both on the gym floor and online. So the first common one I see is people using too much of their arms and their biceps. Yes, you can have a little bit of arm bend when you initiate the pull, but if the first thing that's happening is you pulling with your arms rather than your legs, these muscle groups are going to fatigue very quickly. So what that looks like is you yanking and pulling with the arms first every single time rather than you really using the power of your legs and the power of the hip swing. So to combat that, what I want you to think about doing, as I talked about in that optimal technique, is letting that handle just move forward. So rather than you being here, you're letting it be here so that you've got a nice loose grip with your hands. And I'm thinking about reaching my arms forward as I drive with my legs before I start to think about pulling. You can start thinking about pulling with your arms once that handle gets past the knees. But until that point, you want to think about keeping your arms long, your spine tall, and your torso nice and tall before you start pulling with your arms and you're driving through with the legs first. So fault number 2 is throwing your shoulders back early at the start of the drive phase. The reason why this is bad is because you're essentially limiting the amount of power that you can generate in every single stroke, and your stroke is going to be very short in terms of its power. If I'm starting my catch phase and my shoulders are here back first, I've already used my hip swing. So all I've got is essentially just my body weight to throw myself back and get back into that finish phase. Remember that we want to think about our torso being in front, our hips being back slightly in that catch position with our shins vertical, and we're initiating with the legs first before we go into that hip swing. If I start here first, and I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later on the force curve, but you're going to be using all of that power straight away rather than you setting yourself up for a more powerful hip swing later on. So to combat that, think about, again, your hips being slightly further back than your shoulders, allowing you to have a bit more of a torso lean, and you're pushing through with the legs first before you open up with those hips. Okay, so the third and final fault that I see quite often is a poor return or recovery stroke. So once I've finished in this position here, what will often happen is people bend through the knees first and get back into this start position. What we want to make sure is that we're returning the exact same way as we would do our catch and our drive and our hip swing. So when I finish with my arms, I want my arms to recover first, and then my body, and then my legs. The reason why that could be a negative thing is that if I start with my legs first, I never get back into a good catch position, and similar to fault number 2, my shoulders are behind and I've already opened up my hips before I've started even opening or going into my drive phase. So when I get to this position, we want to get arms first, then lean our torso forward, and then return with our body, rather than finishing or returning with our legs first, and then we end up in this position here. The other thing to think about is that with every single stroke that we do on the row, ideally we want to have as many changes as possible in each stroke, so that with every stroke that we're doing, we are accumulating more meters or more calories. For every chain that we leave short, we're essentially cutting the distance that we accumulate with every single stroke. So we want to think about getting our arms nice and long so that there are more links in the chain going into that flywheel, into that fan. And then when we pull, we want a nice long pull up to here. We don't need to be doing here, but we want to be making sure that we're utilizing that hip swing and every link in the chain that we have before we get back into another stroke. So next thing we're going to talk about is damper setting and drag factor. So something to be mindful of is that the number does not represent the level that you're rowing at. So 10 does not equal better than 1. All this is doing is the higher the number, the more air that is going into this fan. So number 10, the most amount of air, therefore you feel the most amount of resistance, and number 1 would be the least amount of resistance. It doesn't mean that 10 is better than 1. All it means is that it's just going to be different horses for different courses. Every rowing machine will be a little bit different. So the older the machine with more dust in the flywheel, probably the higher your damper setting is going to need to be for you to get the same level of drag factor out. The newer the machine, the lower the damper setting is probably going to be because of the amount of dust or lack of dust that's inside the flywheel. So if you want to be consistent when you're going from gym to gym, rowing machine to rowing machine, you want to look at your damper setting and then look at your drag factor. So what this does is dictates what your drag factor is. I'm going to show you now what the drag factor is. So this is your main menu. To find the drag factor, you're going to go on to more options, display drag factor, and then row to display your drag factor. So the moment that you start rowing, it will start spitting out which number it is. So if you want to increase your drag factor, you're going to bring your damper setting up a little bit, and that will adjust the number, start rowing again. Doesn't matter how hard you row, the drag factor will remain the same. And then if you want to lower that drag factor number, you want to move your damper setting down a little bit on the rower. A general ballpark for you to aim for is maybe somewhere between 115 to 140 for your drag factor. All that the drag factor is doing is measuring how slow the flywheel is slowing down, or how quickly the flywheel is slowing down. This is taken from rowing out on the water, and it's essentially dictating how fast or how slow the flywheel is slowing down, and it's the same thing as essentially how slippery your boat is in the water. So it doesn't really mean that much for those of us that are doing a Hyrox or doing a CrossFit competition or anything like that, but you want to find a number that works well for you. Now, if you were doing some kind of a sprint or a very, very short distance, you probably want your damper setting a little bit higher and your drag factor a little bit higher. The other thing that might determine whether you want a higher drag factor is your weight and your gender. So typically a heavy, tall man is probably going to want the drag factor close to about 140, and a lighter, shorter woman might need a lighter or a lower drag factor. It all depends on what it is that you're doing from a race perspective, but a ballpark to aim for somewhere between 115 to 140 for your drag factor. So a slightly more advanced thing that you can use within the machine on the monitor is something called force curves. So essentially all this is you are seeing the amount of area that you have underneath the line or underneath the curve. The more area that you have, the more force that you've applied over the entire stroke, and the smoother the curve, the more that you have applied force throughout that stroke as well. So what we want is a smooth and a large area underneath that curve. Similar to what I was talking about with the links in the chain, all that means is that with every stroke that you do, not only are you more efficient, but you're also generating more power or more meters or more calories for every stroke that you do. So here are a couple of examples within the force curves that you can look at based off of what I was talking about in terms of a full perspective. So in this first clip, you can see what we call a double diamond. Essentially, this is me exploding out of the catch or me ripping with my arms or just trying to rip basically the rower handle as hard as I can. You see that you get a nice big peak at the start and then you get a drop off. So it means that I'm not applying force throughout the entire stroke. So what we want to think about doing is using a little bit more of my legs and applying force a little bit more evenly throughout the entire stroke. On the second clip, you can see here that I have a more even bell curve. So it's a nice application of force throughout the stroke. I have more area underneath that line. So essentially I'm applying more force and I'm accumulating more meters or calories for every stroke that I'm doing. So the next time that you're in a gym, have a go at some of these techniques and try using the drag factor, changing your damper setting, looking at force curves, and hopefully you'll be able to apply some of that into your training and into your competing. Hope that helps.